Well, we've heard these words before. You know, Jesus says, I give you a commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And I was looking at what some of the other preachers have to say about this very familiar passage. I found Elizabeth Johnson, who is the professor at the Lutheran Institute of Theology in Maganga, Cameroon, if I'm pronouncing the first place name correctly. She says this, she says, in this Last Supper account, we hear about many things that Jesus knows and about how he responds to the knowledge that he has. Jesus knows something and then he responds accordingly. She says he knows that his hour has come to depart from this world and go to his Father. How does he respond? Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus knows that the Father has given all things into his hands and that he's come from God and is going to God. Jesus knows that all things rest in his hand. He comes from God, he's going to God. How does he respond? He gets up from the table and takes on the role of a slave, tying a towel around his waist and washing his disciples' dusty, dirty feet. Jesus also knows who is about to betray him. He's very troubled by this knowledge. How does he respond? He announces the imminent betrayal to his disciples and then proceeds to feed his betrayer. He dips the piece of bread into the dish and he gives it to Judas, the traitor, and Judas then leaves. And the narrator says, it was night, a time where deeds of darkness are done under cover of night. But that did not interrupt, the betrayal did not interrupt Jesus' love for Judas. It's at this dark moment that the gospel actually begins. It's after Judas had gone out. We might expect a speech about how evil Judas is and how awful the consequences of his actions will be for him. But Jesus instead focuses on his mission and preparing his disciples for what is to come. So Jesus speaks of being glorified and of glorifying God, which in the language of John, the gospel writer, is a reference to Jesus obeying the Father's will and being lifted up on a cross. And then Jesus tells his disciples in tender words, calling them little children, that he will be with them only a little while longer, and that where he is going, they cannot come. Yes, Jesus also knows that Peter, one of his closest companions, will deny him. Yet Jesus' parting words focus not on blame for their past or future failures, but rather on preparing them for what is to come, promising them that he will no longer be physically present with them, but they will not be abandoned. Now, in the coming chapters, Elizabeth goes on to say, Jesus will talk about the Paraclete, the advocate who will teach and advise and comfort them. Now, Jesus focuses on the need for his disciples to live in community, in harmony, to love one another as Jesus has loved them. It's an easy thing to hear, love one another as I have loved you. It's harder to put it into practice. We have to understand exactly the kind of love of which Jesus speaks and which Jesus demonstrates in his life and in his dying. It's a love which extends from the mundane, washing of someone's feet, to the heroic giving of your life. And it encompasses every kind of self-giving act in between. And Jesus tells his disciples that it is by this kind of love that everyone will know that they are his disciples. In the wonderful poem, How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways, the poet recounts, I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being in ideal grace. But it says, then I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight, nay, morning and evening. You know, my love will be there for you, and however it's called to be. One time I remember, after I'd seen this a million billion times, as an adult, I happened to have been sitting down at a table Sunday visiting my mom and dad. And my sister was there, and my mom says, can I make you something? I said, sure. So she made me a sandwich. And I noticed that she was able to, untie and then tie the little twisty thing around the cellophane bag that the bread came in with one hand. One hand. It came from numerous, uncountable repetitions till she had it down like that. And I had never paid that much attention to it before because I was always concentrating on the sandwich. What you would expect, you know. But as an adult, I happened to see that and I thought, that's been done a million billion times. And talk about the tiniest thing, by sun and candlelight, by morning and evening. Your love can be there in that. Parents know well what that kind of love is. Now, there is an heroic love. There's the mundane, the washing of the feet. There's the heroic, the giving of the life. And my thoughts are, I think a heroic love also means be willing to put yourself at risk by going against the grain in loving someone, by going against the grain of who is in and who is out. It is heroic to personally witness your opposition to all that is unjust, unkind, and especially cruel in the way of our church and our world today. It can be heroic to personally witness against this. Witness your opposition to all that is unjust, unkind, and cruel. Now, Elizabeth Johnson continues, she says, it's often noted that John's gospel focuses on mutual love within a community of disciples and does not speak of love for those on the outside or of love for enemies. It is true that Jesus commands his disciples to love one another. Nevertheless, he also declares God's love for the world, which surely includes those outside of the community of faith. Jesus demonstrates the depth of God's love for this often hostile world in his death on the cross. Shed for you and for all. Shed for you and for the many, so that sins may be forgiven. Now, another article in the scripture noted this, and I can't quote the author because he wasn't listed in it, but I found it in relating to this gospel passage. And the author says this, the preacher says this, he says, we so often draw lines about who we will love and who we will be tempted to cast in the role of less loving in our lives. He says this happens in the hearts and minds of both individuals and the church community. This happens in the hearts and minds of both individuals and the church community. Who do we choose to love? An interesting thing to note in this text is that Jesus is reminding the disciples that they will be known, in fact, to others by the way that they love. And the author says, yes, we would do well to listen to this commandment. We also are called to love others as a mark of our own discipleship. See how these disciples love one another. And that's how they are then known. And before people were ever called Christians, as followers of Christ, they were called followers of the new way, because it was certainly a new thing to return no one evil for evil and to love, without separation, without exclusion, even without trying to determine what the parameters would be for someone to be loved. Just love. It says we would do well to listen to this commandment, and we are also called to love others as a mark of our own discipleship. This action, to love others, is a distinguishing mark of the followers of Christ, and will continue to be. Now, some would say that one of the weaknesses of our church today, and not just the Catholic Church, every church, is the way many people do not embody this commandment, or the others commanding followers to love one another. Love is the essential commandment in all of the religions. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or even more clearly, do not do unto others what you would not have them do to you. And so here in chapter 13, Jesus demonstrates his love for the same disciples who will fail him miserably. This is Elizabeth speaking again. She says, Jesus washes and feeds Judas, who will betray him, Peter, who will deny him, and all the rest who will run away in his hour of greatest distress. The love that Jesus demonstrates is certainly not based on the merit of the recipients, And Jesus commands his disciples to love one another and others in exactly that same way. Elizabeth Johnson says, we disciples of Jesus, speaking about our Christian community, have continually fallen far short in our love for one another, as well as in our love for those outside the community of faith. We failed in our love for those outside our community of faith. She says this, theological and ethical arguments, how well we're acquainted with those today. Theological and ethical arguments often descend into personal attacks and name-calling. Personal interests often trump the common good of the community. Those in need of compassion find judgment instead. Now here's my thoughts. Put another way, how can a church that professes to be a follower of Christ, a Christ who took great pains to publicly welcome and to eat with known sinners, how can a church claim to be following the example of Christ by drawing lines between those who are in and those who are out, accepted and not accepted, invited to the table, or piously, even emphatically, publicly ushered away from it? How can we claim to be following the command to love without distinction when we make separations? And we say that there are some people who are welcome at the table and some people who are not welcome at the table. And those who are welcome are us, and those who are not welcome are the others. Professor Elizabeth concludes, Jesus could not be clearer. It's not by our theological correctness, not by our moral purity, not by our impressive knowledge that everyone will know that we are his disciples. It's quite simply by how we treat each other, by our loving actions, both mundane, washing of the feet, and heroic, witnessing against injustice, cruelty, and unkindness. It is quite simply by loving acts, acts of service and personal sacrifice, acts that point to the love of God for the world made known in Jesus the Christ. It's confusing, isn't it, that we should find ourselves in such dilemmas as to, who do you love? Jesus never made an exception. Never. And if we really thought about it, we would have to say, I am so glad that God is not making exceptions with regard to who is in and who is out. Because you and I, in our most selfless moments, our truest moments of introspection, when we are perhaps not as guarded as we generally are, we might say that, who am I, to enter heaven, except for God's mercy? And so when Jesus says, judge not lest ye be judged, part of it is based upon, it seems to me, this acknowledgement that what we would have for ourselves, we would have for other people. Give to others what you would have for yourself. And if you would not want to be condemned, don't condemn others. Do you remember the story about the poor slave that owed so much money to his master, the king, that he could never pay it back? It was lifetimes of wages. And so he and his whole family were going to be sold into slavery. And what he does is he goes to the master and he begs, he says, please, give me time, be patient with me, and I will pay you everything. And of course, it's a lie. He can't possibly pay it. It's not possible. He's too far in debt. And the king, who already has everything, or the master, who has so much, he says, well, okay. And then the man, having recently been forgiven a multitude and being freed from a life of imprisonment and slavery for himself and his children, finds a fellow slave that owes just a small fraction to him, and he throttles him and beats him and says, pay back what you owe me. And the man pleads and says, I'll do it. And he says, you'll have none of it. Instead, he throws him into prison. Well, I used to always think that it was about greed, that the person who had so much forgiven himself, couldn't let go of the little bit of money that was owed him by a fellow servant. But I think it has to do with not so much greed as a sense of the person not realizing what the master had done for him. The only way he could have been saved from that is by the love of the master, the compassion of the master, the making an exemption for him by the master. And so you would have really thought that once he came to the other guy that owed him a little bit, he might have said, boy, you know what? He says, my life has been changed for the better by somebody else, who forgave me a whole lot more than you owe me. Don't worry about it. Don't sweat the small stuff, my friend, Have a good day. And I think the only way that a person can do that is they forget what God has done for them, what the Master has done for you and for me. In the old Dies Irae, which is what they used to intone or chant at the funeral masses, it was, day of wrath, O day of mourning, now has judgment come a-borning. Who for me be interceding when the just are mercy needing? Spare, O Lord, your servants spare. Do you remember that? Remember the old days when you wore black? And what you would give at the funeral was, multiple perpetual indulgent mass cards for your soul, because we didn't presume that, you were going to get to heaven without some help, right? So we went to white vestments and we emphasized the love of God. But I think in doing that, we somehow have forgotten what a gift it is. We somehow have forgotten how undeserved it is. And if you and I really truly understood what is present in this Eucharist and on the cross, it should probably change our hearts and make us be not just better disciples, but more kindred souls to anybody else that we meet. Jesus, without exception, went to people who were known sinners, and he said, I'm coming to your house today, I'm going to have dinner with you. And then, of course, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and the common people, who felt themselves exempt from that. I'm not sinning that way. They said, who is this person who eats with sinners and welcomes them? He's essentially forgiving them. That's something only God can do. And Jesus says, well, what's easier to say to somebody, your sins are forgiven, or pick up your mat and walk? But that you might know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. And so that's something I think we need to remember more and more. I find it changes my attitude towards other people when I remember how much I am myself in need of mercy.